Welcome to Nous, the podcast where we tackle the deepest questions about the mind. I'm your host, Ilan Goodman, and before we get going, do remember that I'm keen to hear from you. If you want to get in touch to share thoughts, comments, suggestions, even criticisms, maybe invitations to glamorous philosophy and neuroscience parties, if that's a thing, then email me on nousthepodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. In this episode, I'm speaking with a neurogeneticist who's unafraid to tackle some of the most politically charged questions in science. His recent book, INNATE, sets out to show how the wiring of our brains shapes who we are. And in it, he offers his take on the latest research into the biological underpinnings of intelligence, gender, sexuality, and psychiatric disorders. Dr. Kevin Mitchell joins me online from Dublin in Ireland, where he's an associate professor at the Institute of Neuroscience at Trinity College. Kevin, welcome to Nous.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Now, I introduced you as a neurogeneticist, which I have to say in my mind is one of the sexiest job titles I've heard. But
I haven't heard it described that way before, but thanks, I'll take it.
It might just be me, I don't know. But I have also seen you described as a developmental neurobiologist, among other things. What do you prefer and what sort of best describes what you do?
Well, it's funny, neurogenetics is almost a made-up kind of a term, to be honest. My interests are in genetics and neuroscience and the intersection of the two of those things. So I'm interested in, for example, the genetics of how the brain develops, but also the genetics of things like our psychological traits or behavioral traits or psychiatric disorders. And it turns out that those two things actually overlap considerably. A lot of the genetics of our psychological traits is actually the genetics of how the brain develops.
Okay, so anything goes, I guess. The developmental neurobiologist works, neurogeneticist is right. Yeah, okay, great. So your book, INNATE, was published, I think it's just a few months ago.
Yeah.
And it has glowing endorsements on the back from some pretty stellar figures, including Steven Pinker and a favourite of mine, Patricia Churchland, who, if you look at the Nous face collage, she's actually in there. She's featured.
Very good.
Yeah. So to get us going, can you just give us an account of what you set out to do with INNATE, and give us a sense of the central thrust of the book?
Sure. So the central idea really is, the question is, what makes us different from each other? What's the origin of our individual natures? And it's been known, for a long time, really, that genetics plays a big part in that. And so just showing that that's true is not really a big advance. I almost take that as read. I mean, I don't assume that. I give the evidence for it from twin studies and family studies and now large population studies that a large proportion of the variation that we see in people's psychological makeup is due to genetic differences between them. So that's the first part. But really what I want to do is delve into that and ask how. How do genes affect our psychological traits? Because on the one hand, you've got a piece of DNA. And really when we say a gene, what we mean is a genetic variation. So some difference. I might have an A at one position of my DNA code in the genome, and you might have a T. And that might be responsible for, a difference in our personality, a difference in intelligence, a difference in, risk of psychiatric disorders. So you might have something even like that. One difference in a DNA letter inside my cells is ultimately responsible for me thinking that the CIA is reading my emails. Something so incommensurate with so what's the chain of events that could possibly lead that change in the DNA initially in a fertilized egg in a single cell, that change in the DNA sequence to ultimately lead to that difference in a trait. And the ultimately is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because really that's the whole point of INNATE, is that it takes a developmental perspective on that relationship. And actually what it says is that development is the key thing. If you want to understand how genotypes, those differences in DNA variations, affect or contribute to our phenotypes, which is the outward manifestations of our traits, then development is the way you get from genotypes to phenotypes. There's no other way to think about it and make sense of it. And so,
Yeah.
in a way, it was partly a corrective at some oversimplified ways of thinking about too direct a relationship between genes and our psychology. But the other thing that comes out of that is that actually the fact that it's the way the brain develops that's important, is that the way the brain develops is not just dependent on our genes.
Mm.
There's a lot of randomness in how the brain develops. So even identical twins, their brains, even just by the time they're born, they're already unique.
Mm.
They're very, very similar to each other because brain structure is quite heritable. But on top of that, there's a lot of other differences. So if you're looking for sources of variation in our psychological traits, you've got genetics on the one hand, we've also got developmental variation, which is often overlooked because people tend to think of genes and environment, nature and nurture, but there's this third source that's really been overlooked that I think makes a big, big contribution
Yeah.
to a lot of our traits and makes them even more innate than you would think just from the genetic evidence alone.
Yeah, so there's 2 points I want to pick up there. I think people often understand the word innate to just refer to genes,
Yes.
but you're not using it purely to refer to genes. You mean something more. You mean genes and a process of development.
Exactly. So what I would say is that, when I use the word innate, I mean, really, I refer to the outcome of development. And the outcome of development depends on both your genes. What's the program that you've got in your genome that's different from the program that's in my genome? And it depends on just the way that it happens to play out in the run of development. So from run to run, if you had a bunch of clones or in identical twins, it's separate runs of the program, and each time you run it, you don't get exactly the same outcome.
As you put it in the book, you can't bake the same cake twice.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a bit puzzled, actually. Think just hearing you explain that. Innate literally means born with, right?
Yeah. Yes.
But there's this clear sense in which the developmental process you go on is not something you're born with, is not something that's determined by your genetic inheritance, right? The unfolding of the developmental process is an interaction.
Yes, it is, and you can look at the molecular terms. So what the genome encodes is really a set of biochemical rules. So as the embryo is developing, certain cells will make certain amounts of this protein, another cell will make certain amounts of that protein. They signal to each other. They tell this part of the embryo to turn into skin or muscle or nerve cells and so on. So the genome encodes those biochemical rules and relationships and all the feedback processes that allow the self-organization of the embryo and the self-assembly of the brain with all its staggering complexity. But they don't. The genome doesn't specify the outcome.
Mm.
It doesn't know what the outcome is. There's nowhere in the genome that is like a blueprint where parts of the genome correspond to parts of the brain or parts of that just doesn't work that way. It's more like a recipe or a program. But the processes by which it's carried out at a molecular level are noisy. So there's just inherent randomness. When you make a protein, it's just going to diffuse around the cell. There's thermal fluctuations, there's quantum noise at that molecular scale. That means, well, you can make more or less this much protein, but it'll be more or less. It won't be exactly 90 molecules in every cell, and you can't control exactly where they go. So there's a lot of random events that feed into that. And one of the interesting things in brain development is that those random events, because of the self-organizing nature of brain development, it has what mathematicians call non-linearities in it. Or
can I just jump in and say this term self-organizing? It sounds wonderful. What does it mean?
Yeah, so it means that the system organizes itself, right? No one's in charge. No one knows anything. It's all just a bunch of mindless biochemical algorithms being played out with enough feedback mechanisms to robustly produce this outcome, which is a human brain, or if you're starting from my genome, a human brain that's like mine, right? But not exactly like mine every time, just within a certain range. But one of the aspects that's interesting about that is that those kinds of systems that are self-organizing become very sensitive to little changes sometimes in a way that's a bit unexpected. So small amounts of noise can lead to not just small differences in the outcome, a little bit of a bigger brain, say, or something like that, quantitative things, but qualitatively different outcomes that are maybe quite dichotomous, like ending up left-handed or right-handed, or schizophrenic or not schizophrenic.
Is what you're saying, or the ramification of what you're saying, that two genetically identical individuals in identical environments would diverge in the developmental process?
Absolutely, that's absolutely what I'm saying. Yeah, the most obvious is on the two sides of the brain, but you can see it on the two sides of your face. So each of us has basically two runs of the program, because the two sides of our body and our faces, after a certain point of embryogenesis, develop almost independently of each other. So what you can do is, if you take a selfie and you split it down the middle, and you take the left half and make a mirror image of it, and you take the right half and make a mirror image of it, you end up with two quite different looking faces generally. So you can literally see the probability playing out within an organism, which means it's not anything to do with environmental factors that we just don't know about. It's really intrinsic variability.
I mean, and it's fascinating. It might sound like it's a technical point, but actually, doesn't this have repercussions for how much knowing a person's genome can actually tell us, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't it place limits on what we can predict from a genetic sequence?
Absolutely. And we've heard, this is in the news a lot these days. We're learning a lot more and finding a lot of the genetic variations that affect traits like intelligence or personality. We'll shortly, I'm sure, find ones that affect things like, whether you're a psychopath or not, or sexual orientation, or these are all partly genetic traits, and there's no reason to think that we won't be able to find some of the genes that affect those. And then once we do that, there's obviously the possibility that knowing someone's genetic sequence, we could make predictions about their traits. And yeah, the interesting and important thing about this developmental variation is that it is inherently random and unpredictable by its nature. That's what defines it. And it puts a limit in principle, not just in practice, of how good those genetic predictions can ever be.
I guess the interesting question is how much of a limit does it put on that predictability? So your example with the fact that each side of our face is slightly different is an interesting one, but it feels like they're not that different.
Yes.
Right. So how much variability is this randomness introducing? I mean, you said that sometimes self-organizing systems can be set off on very different courses by small changes in conditions along the process of development. So is it possible that this randomness that you're talking about can actually cause two, for example, identical twins to develop in very different ways? Is it possible?
Yes, it's possible, and absolutely can happen. And so there's a bunch of examples of that, and one of the most important ones, I guess, is psychiatric disorders. So, for example, if one twin has schizophrenia, the likelihood that the other one will also have a diagnosis of schizophrenia is about 50%. But about 50% of the time, they don't. Now, within that 50%, there may be some of them who have other psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder or autism or something, because actually it turns out all of those disorders share a genetic basis to them. But you certainly can have one twin who's clinically affected and one who's unaffected or not diagnosed with anything. And so the question is that due to something in the environment? They may have started with the same risk. Is there something in the environment that explains that? And people have looked for environmental factors that influence things like schizophrenia or autism and so on. And there really aren't that many. Actually, I mean, there are a few that are sort of contested, but it doesn't look like there's enough there to explain all of the non-genetic variants in who gets schizophrenia and who doesn't.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you've used this example of schizophrenia. It's definitely one I want to return to. But before we get into the more specific stuff, there's a few sort of general things I wanted to ask you about. And one of these is about the language and the metaphors we use to talk about genetics. Now, some interesting ones have come up already. You dismissed the idea of genes as a blueprint. You were more keen on, I think, the recipe metaphor. In the book, you use terms like instructions and codes. It's a tricky and a dangerous thing, isn't it, these metaphors? Because they're crucial for helping communicate the ideas. But I mean, I'm thinking also of the wonderfully savage spat that Mary Midgley had with Richard Dawkins, where she accused him of, anthropomorphizing genes. The idea of the selfish gene was actually quite political, and it was muddled and confusing, and it was,
Yes, it was,
So metaphorical language is kind of crucial, but it's dangerous. So what was your solution in the book?
It really is a huge challenge. I guess the solution is, first of all, to avoid metaphors that are, I think, obviously conceptual traps. And I think blueprint would be one of those, because it suggests far too direct a relationship between the genome and the outcome, and also too linear a kind of a relationship, in that in a blueprint, part of a blueprint corresponds to part of the structure, and that's not at all the nature of genetic information in the genome. I like the term program better, although people object to that as well, and it certainly has its limits. People also use the idea that the genome is actually a database of relationships, and those have to be read out by the cell. They have to. It's like the phenotype is compressed, and the cell has to do the decompression. But all of those have limits, and I guess my ultimate solution to that in the book is just to explain it, but to not over rely on the metaphor, or just to explain this is what actually happens. Cells make these proteins, they interact with each other. These are the processes by which the brain gets wired. This is why it's noisy in this way. This is ultimately the chain of events that connects a variation in the DNA to a variation in a trait. And just by showing that, rather than using a metaphor, just show what it actually is. I hope that it's actually understandable.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also a fascinating question to know if you can do without metaphor at all. I don't know if you can, but I mean, I think even the idea of information is a metaphor of sorts, right? Or it's drawing on implicitly a whole other discipline and set of ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing that really interests me about this problem of finding the language and the metaphors is the kind of causal relationship that you imply. And the extent to which you kind of position genes as somehow active or passive in building a phenotype, building an organism. And I was quite keen on some work by Dennis Noble.
Yes, I'm familiar with this stuff, yeah.
I mean, he's known as a pioneer of systems biology. And one of his sort of phrases that stuck with me was to reverse how we often think of genes and say that genes are organs of a cell, so that the cell uses the genes as a resource. And that was an interesting way of flipping it, I think. What do you make of that?
I think it's not bad. It's a useful perspective shift insofar as it goes, in the same way that I think the selfish gene hypothesis is a useful perspective insofar as it goes. And to be honest, they're both right. There's an interplay between the genetic information and the cell that's reading it out. And actually, I should say one more thing, because the term innate that we talked about earlier, I don't want to leave it that what I mean by that is just at birth, the idea that development ends at birth, because it doesn't. Development continues, and it continues after birth in a way that's dependent on experience, but it's still a developmental process. So you've still got growth and maturation, but it's informed by your experiences. And so there's an interplay between your innate predispositions and the experiences that you have and the environments that you find yourself in and the way that you respond to things in your environment that's really interesting. And that's where a lot of our behavior, our behavioral character, actually emerges through that interplay. So, in some sense, the effects of the genes are mediated by differences in our environment and our experience and our response to experience. They're not just immediate and they're not set in stone.
Okay. So the word you used there was mediated. That Now, the causal relationship that implies to me is that the genes are going to have an effect, and then that gets sort of diverted and tinkered with by the environment. Is that what you mean to communicate?
Yeah, well, so the question is, does it get diverted or tinkered with or overridden by the environment? And in many people's mind, because of this, ancient way of phrasing it as nature versus nurture, it sounds like they're opposed to each other. And actually, I think that nurture tends to reinforce our nature. So, for example, say you have naturally bright child, and they're good at school, and they like reading, and they like doing academic stuff, and they get encouraged to do that, and their parents encourage them, their teachers encourage them. They get an inherent reward because they're doing well in school. They therefore work harder. There's a virtuous cycle that emerges then, and in that way, their ultimate phenotype of how intelligent they are, which is dependent on their biology and their educational experiences in life. It's the fact that their educational experiences are also dependent on their biology. So they're not separate from each other. In that sense, the environment mediates the effect of the genes.
Yes.
Part of the way that they play out and have their effect is by causing a difference in the environment over time.
Yeah, there was a book I read years ago, Matt Ridley's Nature via Nurture. I wonder if is
Yes.
that phrase useful here, nature via nurture?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, yes. So that encapsulated partly the same idea. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So I want to ask about something that I find intriguing, and I think I might be a little out of date on it. So I'm hoping you can update me. And that's the mystery of missing heritability.
Yes.
So yes. So I'll do my best at explaining what that is, and jump in if I'm getting it wrong, and then hopefully you can enlighten me.
Okay.
So my understanding is that twin studies, family studies, and the field of behavioral genetics in general, that evidence from that leads us to conclude that many psychological traits, many common diseases, many psychiatric conditions are very highly heritable.
Yes.
Right. So schizophrenia, which you've mentioned, has some of the highest estimates of the heritability set it at 80%.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are different stats on that, but
Yeah.
but the highest estimate is 80% heritable. And you depend on evidence from twin studies a lot in your book. You use it a lot.
Yep.
But of course, those methods only tell us how heritable something is overall. So they don't tell us about the particular genes,
Yes.
what particular genes might be involved. So to answer that question, you have to bring in much in sort of newer discipline and the much hyped discipline of molecular genetics.
Yeah.
That, as far as I understand it, is a family of techniques that can track the relationship between specific genetic variants and specific outcomes. But here's the mystery. So even studies using huge populations and the most advanced techniques have not found genes to explain most of the variability in the things we're interested in, like, for example, schizophrenia. So behavioral genetics tells us it's 80%, but when we do huge molecular genetic studies, we don't find the genes that are explaining the variants that we want to explain. And so there seems to be this issue of missing heritability.
You've hit the nail on the head. Absolutely.
And what's your answer?
It's basically a technical problem at the moment. So the heritability that we see from twin and family studies is there. The fact that we have not yet found all of the genetic variants that contribute to it or explain it doesn't make it any less heritable. So that's the first thing. The missing heritability does not undermine the heritability at all. It just says there's a component of that we have not yet found. And so the question is, have we looked in an exhaustive enough way that this actually raises a question about that heritability, or or are we just not looking in the right places so far?
Can I just jump in there? Because one thing that some people have done is to criticize the logic of twin studies. Isn't that right? Like, so some people say, actually, there are some assumptions built into behavioral genetics that might be wrong.
Yes.
You don't subscribe to those criticisms.
I don't, and there's good reason not to. There's good empirical evidence that we should not, because actually you can. So the logic of twin studies is that you're looking to the question that you want to answer is how much of the variation in a trait across the whole population is due to genetic differences. And you flip the question on its head and say, instead of looking for genetic differences and phenotypic differences, I'm going to look at genetic similarity and see how much phenotypic similarity there is. So you look at identical twins who are 100% similar to each other, and you see how similar are they in height or IQ or body mass or whatever the trait is, personality traits, whatever, anything you can put a measure on. And then you compare them to fraternal twins who are just like regular siblings. They're 50% genetic. They share 50% of their genetic variation in common with each other. And then you ask, how similar are they? And if they're significantly less similar, then you can infer and actually mathematically estimate the effect of the extra genetic similarity that the identical twins have. Now, you can do the exact same thing across the whole population. So if you took the population of Dublin, for example, and you looked at everybody there, even if you excluded all the people who you know are related to each other, even to like fifth cousins or something like that, you would still have relationships within that. So people would be, any pair of people will have some level of genetic similarity, and that may be greater or smaller than the level of genetic similarity that other two people share. And so you can use those very distant relationships and look for just a slight increase in phenotypic similarity. And if you do that across enough pairs, you can find the same effect. You can see the same heritability that you see with twins and so on. Up to a certain point. And the point where this falls down is that those distant relationships, they're good at tracking ancient genetic variation. So every generation that happens, some genetic variation gets introduced, because DNA, when it's copied, it's just not completely faithful all the time, and occasionally some errors creep in. So every time sperm and egg are generated, you get some new mutations that enter the gene pool, and most of them don't do anything. Actually, some of them are really bad initially and they'll kill you, and they're immediately selected against and they never get passed on. And then there's a whole bunch in the middle that have tiny effects, but they get passed on, and they spread throughout the population just kind of by chance. And so you end up with these common sites in the genome where, maybe 40% of the people have an A and 60% have a T or a G or something like that. So those ones will be shared between people who are distantly related because they're very ancient. So they have spread through the population. You and I will share some of those. But there are ones that are much more recent, rarer mutations that occurred in my family, in my parents, in their parents, and so on, and into the clan. And so those variants are not well tracked by the population kinds of measures. But the interesting thing about those is, even though they're rare, they tend to have bigger effects. And the reason is that mutations that have a large effect tend to get selected against. So if it's a common variant, by definition almost, it probably is not having a big effect by itself.
Okay.
But the rare ones can have a big effect because natural selection has not had much of time to work on them yet.
Okay.
And so when you do those heritability studies with populations or with twins, you get different answers. So the twin heritability might be, say, 50%, whereas the heritability in across a large population of distantly related people might be 25%. What that means is your missing heritability may be in the rare DNA mutations that these techniques, these genome-wide association studies and molecular genetic techniques, find very difficult to identify because they're so rare.
Okay. So
Sorry, that was a very
no.
long-winded technical answer,
I
but
mean, I
that's
think I followed you. Let's see if we can sort of sum it up. So the missing heritability is the apparent mismatch between the evidence from twin studies and behavioral genetics, which says some things are very, very highly heritable, and the evidence from molecular genetics, which so far has not identified the genes we're looking for that explain.
not all of them.
Not all of them. It's
It's
identified
found some of them, not
but they
all of them. Yeah,
explain only a much smaller percentage than we want to explain of the
that's right.
phenotypic variants.
Yes.
And your explanation for that is that the behavioral genetics is picking up on more recent and much rarer mutations and variations that explain a lot of variance in, let's say, IQ or in height or whatever it is, that the molecular genetic studies aren't yet picking up, but they're going to.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly right.
Okay. Great. So let's move on to one of the specific topics that you tackle in your book. Now, it's I'm guessing it's sort of testament to the political sensitivity of questions around gender that I sat up a little straighter when I read certain, I think, ostensibly quite innocuous sentences in your book, which I'm guessing for you a straightforward statement of fact. So, for example, the brains of males and females are literally wired differently, both in neuroanatomy and in neurochemistry.
Yeah.
And then another fact that I learned from your book, which surprised me, I'd never heard it before, that the brains of men are on average 10% larger than women's,
Yes.
even when you take into account the difference in body size. Now, I mean, these, I think for you, are presumably uncontroversial statements.
Well, they're just data. Those are just observations.
What I'm getting at is, immediately I'm thinking of Jordan Peterson saying that the gender pay gap is natural because men and women are biologically different from evolution, etc. Or, the infamous Google memo, which argued something similar. And they kind of draw on this kind of evidence. Now, can you perhaps say a little bit about the general differences between men's brains and women's brains, or male brains and female brains, and let's see if we can navigate this quagmire?
Sure. So first of all, I think the drawing conclusions about social implications from this stuff is generally not warranted by the observations themselves. So the observations are, well, first of all, evolutionarily, any species that has sexual reproduction has two sexes, male and a female. One of them, produces usually a big gamete, an egg, that doesn't travel, and then you hit sperm that do travel, and you have to get them together. So by virtue of that, what you want is your two sexes to be different from each other in a way that they don't waste time mating with the same sex, basically, because you want to wire in sexual preference, basically, because mating is a costly, energetically costly thing to do. It takes up lots of resources that you could spend doing something else, and so on. So sexual preference is a really, really hardwired trait across the entire animal kingdom, and it's an extremely strongly genetic trait in humans, in the sense that if you look across a bunch of human beings, there's a single genetic element that strongly tells you whether they're going to be attracted to males or females, and that's the presence or absence of the Y chromosome. So in behavioral genetic terms, sexual preference is probably one of the strongest, most genetic traits that we know of in humans, although we don't tend to think of it that way because we think of it like it's a default, that a heterosexual orientation is just a default state, and it's not. It's two different states that have to be actively put in place, and that doesn't just happen. There have to be brain circuits that mediate that sexual preference. There's a program there's a genetic program, part of the program of brain development, that is involved in masculinizing or feminizing various circuits in the brain, and one of the most important sets of circuits are the ones that control sexual preference, whether you're attracted to males or females. So that in itself is a very strongly genetic trait, but there's also potentially variation in that program that carries it out. So there's lots of different genes and proteins involved in wiring the brain circuits in such a way that you will be attracted to males or females. And we know a fair bit about that from studies in mice and rats and so on. We can get down into particular circuits that are involved in these kinds of preferences, and presumably the same circuits are at play in human brains as well, because we're not that different from mice, as it happens. So generally speaking, the general rule is if you have a Y chromosome, the brain gets masculinized and you're attracted to females. But there's a whole process that's at play in that, with a bunch of other genes that are involved to mediate those effects. And if you have genetic variation in those genes, then that program can be affected in such a way that you don't end up masculinizing the brain circuits that mediate sexual preference. And then you can have homosexual orientation. And similarly in females, there's a program of feminization that's an active process. It's not just the default, it's an active process that's required. And you can have mutations in those genes or variations in those genes that similarly can affect sexual preference in females, where you can end up with a homosexual orientation, as exceptions to the normal rule, which would be matching of that sexual orientation with the sex of the gonads.
Yeah. So is there a sort of well worked out biological story of sexuality then? Yeah, you're making it sound like there is. Is that sort of available?
Well, it's reasonably well worked out in rats and mice, where we can manipulate a lot of things, but also it's easier to look at in rats and mice because they rely on olfactory cues, pheromones, very much. And that the pheromone system codes information in a fairly simple way that we can manipulate. Humans rely much more on visual cues.
Can we breed homosexual rats?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can make mutations in mice or rats that cause homosexuality.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
So sorry, what I was saying was in humans, we rely much more on visual cues for sexual preference. And there it's really difficult actually to try and understand how the visual parts of the brain code a male or a female body form, say, and then can in some way wire that innately to a preference for a typical female form or a typical male form. So it's much more complex in humans, the things that are cues for sexual preference. But the underlying idea that there is something hardwired there is there's no reason to think that it's any different. And there are some neuroanatomical studies in the brains of, say, men who are homosexual or women who are homosexual that look at some particular structures that show a more female form in homosexual men, or vice versa in homosexual women. They're a little sketchy at the moment. They're small samples, so the actual neuroanatomical details are not well worked out in humans. But I don't see any reason to doubt the underlying basis of that. And it's a similar process that happens all the way down to fruit flies, where again we have a terrific understanding in fruit flies of the circuitry that mediates all aspects of innate courtship behavior and sexual preference and so on. And we can control individual neurons in the brain that will drive a male to mate with another male versus a female and all that kind of stuff. So the logic of it is well worked out. The principles, I think, are highly conserved. The actual elements that are used to build it probably differ species by species, but I don't see any reason to think that the underlying premise is any different.
Okay. So does that mean that there are either a family or a set of genes that predispose to homosexuality, or is it more of a developmental story about conditions in the womb or something like that? Because you're saying it is ultimately determined by the way the brain develops, right?
That's right. Yeah. So homosexuality is partly heritable. About 30 to 40% of the variation in sexual orientation is down to genetic differences. But it's one of these things that for me, I think the non-genetic component there is probably mostly developmental. And the reason for that is that sexual orientation seems to be so refractory to outside influences. There's been tons and tons of people who've tried to change people's sexual orientation or change their own sexual orientation largely without success. I think of it like handedness, actually.
Mm,
Handedness is also partly heritable, but I think highly innate and highly refractory to environmental influences.
mm,
So, what I think happens is that in the development of the brain, the pathways that masculinize or feminize the brain are actually not independent of each other, they're actively antagonistic. So if one of them is being activated, it is actively turning off the other pathway. So they're competing with each other.
mhm,
And so when that happens, what you get is a switch mechanism. When one of them starts to gain the upper hand, if there's some initial confusion, when one of them starts to gain the upper hand, it will quickly dominate over the other one because it shuts the other one off.
mm.
So in that sort of scenario, and this is speculative, but in that sort of scenario, you can end up with developmental variation being part of what switches the trajectory down one pathway or another, and that can explain why you end up with twins, identical twins, who one of them's right-handed, one of them's left-handed, one of them's gay, one of them's straight. Maybe also back to our other topic, one of them's schizophrenic, one of them isn't.
But it's fascinating to me, the question of, if your story is right, how do we explain the kind of huge variability through history of how people have thought about what people haven't
Sure.
had the same concept of homosexuality in the
Yeah.
way that we have now.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's really interesting to understand, is this concept of homosexuality the correct one that's sort of objectively
Mhm.
scientifically true? Or should we actually see it as a historical contingent concept that,
Yes.
it's a concept that hasn't been fixed through different cultures and times?
Yeah. The way that I think of that is that there's a biological predisposition that is not dependent on culture, but the expression of that is dependent on culture, and certainly the way that people view it is dependent on culture. And I think that's probably true for lots of things to do with sexuality and sex differences. So there may be, differences in other things between the sexes. Well, they're not. There may be. There are. So, for example, physical aggression is much more stronger trait in males than in females, and that's true not just in humans. It's true in chimps. It's true in monkeys. It's true in rats. It's true in mice.
Mm,
This is a universal across mammals, and there's a good reason for that. It comes back to mating strategies and male competition and so on. There's a strong difference there, and then there's sort of intermediate differences in, well, let me say there's no difference in intelligence, in average intelligence between males and females,
hmm
which I think is really
mm,
interesting. In that there is a difference in brain size
yes.
on average, and within each sex, brain size correlates with intelligence partly.
So bigger people with bigger brains tend to be more intelligent. There's a rough correlation, right?
Yeah, and the correlation is about, zero point 0.2 or zero point 0.3, mathematically speaking, where one would be a perfect correlation and zero would be no relationship. So it's a partial correlation. But if that correlation held across the sexes, then you would expect the mean intelligence in men to be higher than in women, and it isn't. And that's really interesting, because what that suggests is that even with differently sized brains on average, males and females are capable cognitively of the same performance, which suggests there must be some compensating or other differences in the organization of the brains that enable that break that relationship between brain size that we see within each sex.
Mm.
They break that relationship between the sexes. So so for intelligence, there isn't a difference in mean. There is a difference in variance.
Okay, so the distribution of intelligence scores is different in males and females.
Exactly. So if you imagine a bell curve, and you squish it you squish it down on the top, and the edges go up a little bit at the end. That's like the male one. So you take the female one and you squish it a little bit, then you get more males at the extremes, both ends, and slightly fewer males in the middle.
So there are more men with very low intelligence and very high intelligence than women.
Yes. And it's interesting, if you look at almost any trait, any quantitative trait between males and females, in any species that has males and females, males will be more variable. And the reason that people think this is true, it goes back to this idea that I was talking about before about genetic robustness of the developmental program. So males have only one X chromosome and females have two. And there's loads of really important developmental genes on the X chromosome, and they control the expression of lots of other genes on the other chromosomes. And if you have genetic variation on the X chromosome, females are much less likely to be affected by that because they have a backup copy. So what that means is males are slightly more sensitive to genetic variation on the X chromosome, and that leads to greater variability in all kinds of things that you look at. Any trait that you care to measure between males and females across many species will show more variability in males.
Great. Okay. So last topic. You have said that psychiatric disorders are genetic conditions, and I think I'm right in saying that you hold out hope, or you think that there's evidence already that genetics can revolutionize psychiatry. Why do you think that?
Well, I probably said that in the book, actually, and I think I might temper revolutionize a little bit, but it certainly can inform aspects of psychiatry in some cases. So I think that if you look at psychiatric diagnoses like autism or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, it's important to realize that these are constructs. These are artificial constructs. This is human beings looking at people with certain profiles or clusters of symptoms and saying, that's a thing. And this cluster of symptoms over there, that's a different thing. And that act of us categorizing them may or may not be carving nature at its joints. Those may not be natural kinds. And in fact, if we look at the genetics, it looks like they're not natural kinds because, for example, if you're related to someone with schizophrenia, well, your risk of schizophrenia is increased because there's a genetic contribution to that risk. But your risk of bipolar disorder is also increased. Your risk of autism is increased. Your risk of epilepsy is increased. So there's a sort of a wide range of conditions that can emerge from some underlying developmental risk or what can be called developmental brain dysfunction. So knowing that is useful in a way because it sort of says that our psychiatric categories are not so hard and fast. They're not really necessarily so different from each other. They're different outcomes, but they may have overlapping etiology or causes. But the other aspect when you get into the genetics is that if we take any one of those things, say schizophrenia, or maybe autism is a better example, we know a little bit more about it right now. It's not one thing. Not only is it not a thing in unto itself, it's not one thing. It's an umbrella term for many different genetic conditions, like intellectual disability is. So intellectual disability encompasses many different genetic conditions like Down syndrome and Williams syndrome and Fragile X syndrome and the list goes on. There's literally hundreds of them known where a mutation in this gene or that gene or that gene can result in intellectual disability. And it turns out that autism is very similar to that. A mutation in gene A or gene B or gene C or gene D can result in the symptoms of autism. And sometimes they'll go along with ADHD or intellectual disability or epilepsy in various patients. But what genetics offers is a way to get past the superficial category that we call autism, which we know is an umbrella term, down to maybe a syndrome like Fragile X syndrome, where we can say, okay, all of these people have the same genetic cause. Now, maybe that means we can use that to predict something about these people, knowing the genetic cause that we wouldn't have been able to predict just knowing their symptoms. So it lets you sub-diagnose people genetically and add that bit of genetic information to your clinical treatment or management of the condition. And in some ways, that can help in other ways. It doesn't obviously change the treatment. For some things it does, for others not. The ultimate hope would be that knowing that initial molecular difference might give you a therapeutic angle to treat whatever was wrong in that genetic syndrome.
Mm.
Now, if it's something like a metabolic disorder, like phenylketonuria, for example, PKU, can result in intellectual disability, because we can detect it, we can treat that with diet, and that means we remedy the situation, but we remedy it before it even happens. So if we can detect things at birth, maybe there's a possibility for intervention directly into the pathway that's affected by the gene that's disrupted.
Yeah.
I think those cases will be unusual. I think what will have to happen is that actually we'll use these genetic discoveries of very rare mutations that can result in these symptoms and actually study them, for example, in animals, so that we can work out the cascade of events that ultimately leads to a behavior in an animal that we recognize as psychopathology in a human being, in such a way that we can say, okay, when this gene is mutated, these circuits are disrupted in this way. Ultimately, the brain operates in a different fashion here and here, in this circuit and that circuit. And once we get to that understanding, which is miles away because we don't know how the brain works, but once we get to that level, then we may be able to say, you know what, I know enough about how this circuit works here that I can tweak it with something else, and the something else won't be anything related to what the gene was doing that was involved in brain development, but it may help us tweak the way the circuit works in an adult that could treat, not say autism itself, because that's a description of really who the person is actually, but some of the symptoms that can go along with it, like excessive anxiety, for example, the symptoms that people suffer from, and that may be medically helpful for those people.
Okay.
But it's a long road to travel, but there's a pathway of discovery that is foreseeable as a real potential, I think.
Yeah. So I interviewed a clinical psychologist in a previous episode called Dr. Lucy Johnston, who has quite a radically different view on these kind of topics than you. But without going into too much detail, I think it's interesting that, let's take the example of schizophrenia. I think schizophrenia is an example of a trait where there is missing heritability, as we were discussing earlier. So we have there's evidence from twin studies from behavioral genetics that it's highly heritable, but then the sort of huge genome-wide association studies have thrown up signals that explain only a few percent of the occurrence of schizophrenia in the population. So we haven't found genetic signals yet that are very explanatory. And some people have used it. Well, so there's all sorts of things to say in response to that. So in one thing to say is that the diagnosis of schizophrenia, as you say, may not be a valid category. It may not be a natural kind, was the term you used. So it may be that, and I think this is the kind of agenda that's being pursued in America, and it's a kind of, I guess, fairly mainstream logic that if you explore specific symptoms that get labeled under the category of schizophrenia at the moment, and you then try and find biological causal accounts for why each of those symptoms emerge, then you have new diagnoses. You can make new diagnoses from those, so we chuck out schizophrenia and you make new ones. And this seems to be kind of what you're suggesting, is that the genetics, it will eventually give us sort of causal stories about how certain mechanisms in the brain develop and become dysfunctional, and therefore give rise to these problematic symptoms. So is your idea that something like schizophrenia will eventually break down into specific things which we have clear biological accounts as to why they emerge? Is that sort of where you think ultimately we're heading?
Kind of. So what I don't want to suggest is that any particular genetic condition will always result in symptoms A, B, and C. and a different condition will always result in symptoms C, D, and E,
Mm.
because any individual mutation will still have quite a variable presentation for at least two reasons. One is that, say, the Fragile X mutation, well, any two carriers of that will also have other mutations in their genetic background that modify how that phenotype is expressed in an individual. And then you have all this developmental variation on top of that. And in some cases, then, of course, you'll have experience and environmental things after the person is born that might act as a trigger, say, for a psychotic episode or something like that. So there's still going to be a lot of complexities in the relationship between genotypes and phenotypes, even when we know specifically what we think of as the causal, the main causal mutation. And I should say, even in cases where there is a main causal mutation, there definitely will be other mutations in the background that are contributing factors. So these are called complex genetic disorders for a reason. They really are complex and multifactorial. But what I hope that this research agenda can accomplish by using these mouse models and so on is to just use the genetics as an entry point to get to the neurobiology in a way that we know at least that the construct we're using in a mouse when we make a mutation is relevant to the disorder, because it's a rare mutation in humans that is associated with high risk. So if we can get to the neurobiology in that way and figure out that actually we can induce psychosis in a mouse, and we can figure out it's this brain circuit acting in this way, and once we know that, we can develop better antipsychotics, then that will be a profitable avenue to follow. Or if we can, look in particular genetic conditions and say, the likelihood of this person developing psychosis is much higher than the likelihood of that person, then there may be implications for clinical management in, even prophylactic sense, that can be clinically useful as well. And of course, the other thing is that genetic information is useful for potentially for reproductive choices if people want to make those choices based on that information. So if they know, for example, that they've had a child with autism, and the causal factor is a mutation that one or other of the parents carries that the child inherited, then they may make certain reproductive choices. If, on the other hand, it's a new mutation that neither of the parents carry, then that means there's no more risk to any future siblings, which is something that people naturally tend to worry about. And so, in fact, I think the initial impact of genetics on clinical things will be in the area of reproductive diagnostics and choices that people may choose to make there, if they want to do that themselves, and if they're in an area, a jurisdiction that allows that to happen. And of course, there's a whole host of ethical considerations around all of that. So yeah, basically, there's multiple areas where the genetics, I think, can inform psychiatry, and right now it hasn't really lived up to the full extent of that promise yet. But I don't think there's any reason that just because it hasn't done it yet to think that it won't, or there's certainly no reason to think that that means that those things are not as heritable as we think that they are.
Okay, cool. Last question. So in the final chapter of the book, you deny that the account that you're offering in any way undermines our sense of free will. And just drawing on, your account of psychiatric conditions, your account of sexuality, they're all heavily biological. And I guess I just wanted you to leave us with an outline of your thoughts on how we can both be entirely biological and also free.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, for personality traits, those traits are just the baseline of our behavior. They don't control our behavior on a moment-to-moment basis. That behavior emerges over our lifetime as our character develops and as our habits develop. And it's informed by those initial differences that we have, but it's not limited by that. And so we are still in control, and we can override our habits Our brain has evolved in a way that we can exercise conscious control over our choices. And that's not just an illusion in the way that some neuroscientists seem to think that it is. It's really possible to develop a philosophical framework, and this is definitely not going to be a short answer, that can account for a true kind of agency that is situated in the organism itself as a causal factor in the universe, not just something that other causes act on, and not just something where internal causes that the organism is not in any way in control of propel the behavior of the organism.
Lovely, lovely. Well, thank you. It's a tantalizing topic to end on, one which I will be picking up in future episodes of the podcast. But the idea that consciousness is real and we are free, even though we're entirely biological, is a delicious thought to finish on. So thank you for speaking with me, Kevin.
Excellent. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I apologize for my Tom Waits voice.